The mornings in Groville, Alabama, always carried a particular kind of weight for 17-year-old Mark Henderson. Under the cover of early light, the town's streets were silent but for the steady hum of a passing car or the whisper of a newspaper flicking open in the hands of a man lingering by the cafe. Everything seemed to move with deliberate slowness, like the heavy air that clung to him. Mark's day began early. At dawn, when he dragged his small shoeshine box to a station in front of Groville National Bank, a colossal building that seemed to press down on Main Street, its marble columns and glass windows glittering with unattainable power. To the men passing by, Mark was just another shoeshine boy, neat clothes, his shoes polished to a shine despite their age and wear. He was invisible, they thought. But as he lowered his head to polish their shoes, he listened. He listened to bankers, businessmen, and city officials speak as if he were part of the street, a fixture, not a person. And over time, he had become quite skilled at taking mental notes, storing away fragments of their conversations like precious gems. Mark kept his secrets in a worn leather notebook he'd tucked under his shoeshine box. In it, he scribbled quickly between clients, phrases, percentages, names, numbers. He understood that these bits of knowledge held power, a power that people like him were seldom permitted to access. Listening to talk about mortgage rates, property values, and real estate deals was more than idle curiosity. It was a key, one he intended to use to open the doors that had always been locked to him. That afternoon, the southern heat clinging to his skin like a second layer, Mark was deep in his work, shining the scuffed leather of Mr. Thompson's shoes. Mr. Thompson, a local businessman with a smug air and loud voice, was boasting to a colleague about a recent deal that had brought him a windfall. Mark's fingers worked rhythmically, buffing and polishing, but his ears sharpened, catching every word. Mr. Thompson leaned closer to his companion, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried just enough for Mark to hear. "Bought it dirt cheap, bank thinks it'll bounce back double the price next year," he said with a grin. Mark's mind raced. So the bank was buying low, betting on properties in certain areas that others overlooked. His hand slipped briefly, and he caught himself casting a quick glance around. No one had noticed. He'd found a rhythm in hiding his interest, in keeping his head down and listening, only ever listening. He imagined that if he ever looked Mr. Thompson in the eye, if he ever dared to speak up, the world would come crashing down. Yet his daydream was shattered when he caught the sight of Mr. Avery, a chauffeur to one of the wealthiest men in town. Mr. Avery was crossing the street, his gaze fixed on Mark with a hard suspicion that made his skin crawl. Mark didn't need to hear a word. Mr. Avery's sharp eyes told him that he was in trouble.
"Hey, boy."
Mr. Avery's voice boomed across the sidewalk as he strode over, his shadow stretching long and dark over Mark's shoulder. Mark straightened, his heart a tight knot in his chest, his voice still as steady as he could make it.
"Yes,
sir," he replied, the words a habit, a reflex that tasted bitter. Mr. Avery's lips twisted into a sneer. "You think I haven't seen you? Sitting there, ear pressed to the ground, poking your nose in business that doesn't concern you? You're here to shine shoes, not spy on people's business." The words came out with a venom that felt personal. But Mark held his ground, forcing his hands to stay calm by his side. "I'm just doing my job, sir," he managed, trying to keep the tremor from his voice. Mr. Avery's gaze narrowed, his voice dropping low, like a growl. "You'd best remember your place.
boy. Keep this up."
And I'll tell your daddy what you've been up to." The words were a threat as heavy as the sweltering Alabama heat. His father had warned him often about Groville's rules, about how a black boy didn't need to know the business of white men and how curiosity could lead to ruin. Mark bit back his response, his pride swelling against the silence he forced himself to keep.
"Yes,
"Sir," he muttered, collecting his supplies and heading home, Mr. Avery's shadow trailing close behind him. That evening, their modest two-room house felt smaller than ever, the walls pressing in on him, the echoes of his father's voice hanging in the air. George Henderson, his father, was a quiet man, worn down by years of hard labor, of swallowing his pride to put food on the table. When Mark entered, his father looked up from his seat at the small kitchen table, eyes narrowing with the kind of knowing that only fathers have. What happened today? Mark? Mark hesitated but knew better than to lie. He explained everything, the words he'd overheard, the notebook he kept, Mr. Avery's threat. His father's face darkened, an anger and fear flaring up in his eyes. You think listening to these white men will make you rich? They won't let you have a slice of their pie. Mark. They'll crush you if they know you're even thinking about it. Mark looked down, feeling his father's frustration cut through him, but his own anger pushed against it, bold and rising. I have to try.
Dad.
I'm not going to shine shoes forever, or sweep floors, or beg for scraps. I want more than this. I deserve more than this. His father's shoulders slumped, his voice softening to a murmur. You're smart.
Mark.
Smarter than most. But you can't survive if you don't know your place. This town, it'll eat you alive.
Boy.
But George's eyes softened as he reached for Mark's notebook, flipping through its pages with an expression that shifted from frustration to something almost like pride. You wrote all this? He asked quietly, running a rough hand over the pages.
Yes.
Sir. Mark replied, trying to catch the glimmer of approval in his father's face. With a slow shake of his head, George placed the notebook back on the table. You've got a gift, son. But Groville, this place will only break you down. He stood, leaving Mark with a final, heavy glance. Keep your head down, Mark. Don't go asking for trouble. But as the night settled over him and he lay in bed, staring up at the cracked ceiling, his father's words only seemed to stoke the fire inside him. Maybe his father was right, and Groville was a cage. But Mark had seen the world outside its iron bars and flashes, in the glimmer of distant promises. And he knew he had to reach for it. He had to prove that his life was worth more than shining shoes on the curb of Groville's bank. That night, as the crickets chirped and the cicadas droned, Mark whispered his own vow, quiet and fierce against the darkness. I'll find a way. I'm going to change everything.
And, for the first time,
the words felt as real as the air in his lungs, filling him with a purpose that would carry him beyond Groville's dusty streets and into a future he was ready to build on his own terms. The Los Angeles heat felt different. In Groville, it had been a slow, sticky weight pressing on him. But here, the air pulsed with a dry intensity, buzzing with energy as if the whole city were a live wire. Humming with potential, Mark Henderson stepped out of the cramped bus, his wife Clara and their young son close behind him. They were standing at the edge of a sprawling city that seemed to stretch forever. All steel and glass, the towering buildings glinting under the fierce California sun. The journey had taken 3 days by train, then by bus, each mile further from Alabama filling Mark with equal parts fear and excitement. As they gazed out at the maze of streets, a sense of awe washed over him. Groville had been suffocating, a place where every corner reminded him of his limitations. But here, in this city that moved faster than anything he'd ever known, he felt something bloom in his chest. This was a place where he could become anyone, a city big enough to hold his ambitions. Their temporary home was a small, dimly lit room at the back of Clara's Uncle Joe's house, barely big enough to hold the bed and dresser that were wedged into it. Joe Carter had lived in LA for 2 decades, working as a custodian at a factory. He was a broad-shouldered man with skeptical eyes that took in everything with a hardened cynicism. And while he had agreed to take them in, Mark sensed the wariness in Joe's gaze whenever he talked about his plans. Young blood, don't be getting any ideas above your station. Joe grunted one evening as they sat around the cramped kitchen table, his voice low and gruff. California ain't no different than Alabama when it comes to folks like us. You'd best stick to finding yourself a job. Make steady money. Ain't no shame in a little hard work. Mark forced a respectful nod, holding back the retort building in his chest. Thank you, Uncle Joe, he said evenly. But I didn't come all this way to settle for what's given. I came here to own something. Joe's laugh was harsh, the sound bouncing off the faded walls. Own something? You think they'll let you own so much as a sidewalk in this city? White folks barely let you look at their buildings. And you think you'll buy one?
Dream on.
Kid. The dismissal burned. But Clara's voice cut in, firm and steady. I believe in him. Uncle Joe. And if we have to struggle for a little while, then we will. Joe leaned back, shaking his head. All right.
Then.
But don't say I didn't warn you. This city don't owe you nothing. Mark. That night, Mark lay in bed staring up at the water-stained ceiling. Clara asleep beside him. His mind churned with his uncle's words, the doubt crawling through him. But as the city hummed outside, the sounds of passing cars and distant music mingling in the air, he held tight to the determination that had carried him this far. Groville had taught him to listen, to observe, to collect secrets.
And now,
He'd use those secrets, those fragments of conversations and numbers stored in his mind, to find a foothold in this city. The next morning, Mark started his routine. Each day, he walked the streets of Los Angeles, taking mental notes on every neighborhood he passed through. He studied the buildings, the signs in the windows, the faces of the people rushing past. He memorized which properties had for sale signs, which ones looked neglected or run down, knowing these were the ones with potential. One afternoon, he found himself in front of an apartment building on the west side of the city. It was a modest structure, worn around the edges but sturdy, standing in a predominantly white neighborhood. The for sale sign in the window seemed almost like an invitation. Mark's heart raced as he imagined the possibilities. A building he could renovate, fill with Black professionals who, like him, were looking to escape the overcrowded neighborhoods. As he studied the building, a white man in a suit approached, eyeing him with a mixture of suspicion and disdain. "Can I help you with something?" the man asked, his voice cool. Mark straightened his posture,
his voice steady.
"I'm interested in buying this property." The man's brows shot up, his mouth twisting into a smirk. "Buying? You mean renting, don't you?" "No," Mark replied calmly, fighting back the anger tightening in his chest. "I mean buying." The man let out a disbelieving chuckle. "You do realize this is a white neighborhood, don't you?" Mark held his gaze, his voice unwavering. "I do, but I also know that money's green, and I have a legitimate interest in this property." The man's laughter faded, and his eyes hardened.
"Well,
"Good luck with that," he sneered before walking away, leaving Mark standing alone in the afternoon sun. But the encounter didn't discourage him, it only made him more determined. He had crossed half the country to be here, and he would be damned if he let anyone scare him off. That evening, he shared the encounter with Clara in their tiny room. She listened intently, her eyes reflecting a mixture of pride and concern. "Mark, you know they won't make this easy for us. Are you sure this is the right move?" Mark nodded, a fierce certainty in his eyes. "It's the only move, Clara. The Black neighborhoods here are bursting at the seams, and sooner or later, they'll have to expand. If we're the ones who own property in the white neighborhoods, we'll be ready for it." Clara reached out, taking his hand, her faith in him clear. "Then let's do it. But we might need help." It was Clara who suggested Joe Mitchell, an old friend from Groville who had moved to LA years earlier and now ran a popular jazz club. Joe was well-connected and wealthy, known for his bold, sometimes reckless business moves. But he was also known to be skeptical and wary of those who didn't have the means to back up their ambitions. A few days later, Mark and Clara walked into Plantation, Joe Mitchell's club, a dimly lit room alive with the sounds of saxophones and smooth jazz. The place was buzzing, filled with well-dressed patrons and clouds of cigarette smoke. Joe stood near the bar, dressed in a sharp suit with an easy, a confident grin as he spotted them. "Clara,"
Joe called,
his eyes lighting up as he hugged her warmly. But as his gaze settled on Mark, the warmth cooled, replaced by a wary curiosity. "And who's this fine gentleman?" This is my husband, Mark.
Clara said.
A note of pride in her voice. We're here to talk business. Joe raised an eyebrow, a skeptical smile playing on his lips. Business.
Huh.
And what kind of business would that be? Mark took a deep breath. Steadying himself, he laid out his vision: buying buildings in transitioning neighborhoods, renting to Black professionals who were eager for a way out of overcrowded communities. As he spoke, Joe listened with a mixture of interest and amusement, his expression shifting between curiosity and mockery. So, you want to play in the big leagues? Huh, Joe finally said, leaning back in his chair with a chuckle. You think just because you've got a little cash and a big idea, they're going to welcome you into their world with open arms? Mark's jaw tightened, his tone steady but firm. I'm not asking for permission.
Joe.
I'm looking for a partner who sees potential in a market that's about to change. Joe laughed again, but there was a glint of respect in his eyes. I like your spirit,
Mark.
but I don't run a charity. And let's be real, you don't exactly fit the profile of the folks who own those buildings. Before Mark could respond, Clara leaned forward, her gaze steady. We're not asking for charity.
Joe.
We're asking for a partnership. You've got connections, we've got the drive and the vision. It's a good deal. Joe's amusement faded, his face serious as he looked between them. After a long pause, he nodded.
All right.
You bring me a deal that no one can refuse, and we'll talk. Refusing to be discouraged, Mark spent the next weeks scouring the city, determined to find the perfect property. Finally, he stumbled upon a neglected apartment building on the edge of a neighborhood in transition. White flight had begun, and the property values were dropping fast, making it a prime target for his vision. When he returned to Joe's club, excitement thrumming through his veins, Joe raised an eyebrow. Back so soon? Henderson? Didn't get enough of a reality check last time?
Mark sat down.
His expression resolute. I've got a deal worth your time.
Joe.
And if we pull this off, it'll prove that we belong in this city, whether they like it or not. As he laid out his plans, Joe listened in silence, his skepticism slowly giving way to intrigue. And as they struck their first deal, Mark felt the first stirrings of victory, a small but significant step toward proving that the world could be changed. One building at a time. The sky was just beginning to soften with dawn as Mark and Clara Henderson, alongside Matt Sullivan, stepped onto the streets of West Los Angeles. They were headed to a small, aging apartment building tucked into a block that felt out of place amidst the newer developments cropping up across the city. The building wasn't much to look at, its brick facade faded and chipped, windows clouded with grime. But for Mark, it was a golden opportunity. They walked quietly, letting the morning light settle over them, each person carrying a different set of nerves and dreams. Mark's chest tightened as they approached the door. This wasn't just another building. It was the start of a long battle he was more than ready to fight. He could almost feel the weight of his hometown of Groville on his shoulders, the memories of the heavy, humid air thick with unspoken rules. But here, in Los Angeles, he wasn't just the shoeshine boy lingering outside the bank. Here, he was a businessman with a plan. Matt, a white man from a poor background who had quickly become Mark's closest ally, checked his watch and shifted his feet. Mark noticed the way Matt fidgeted, his eyes darting around, adjusting his tie and brushing a nervous hand over his hair. You ready? Mark asked, keeping his voice steady, his gaze steady on Matt.
Yeah.
Matt replied, exhaling deeply. But they'll look right through me. Mark, these people aren't stupid. They know this building has black buyers written all over it. Mark clapped a firm hand on Matt's shoulder. They'll see exactly what they want to see, he said. You know the plan. And we've gone over every detail. Just stick to it.
Clara,
who stood nearby, gave Matt an encouraging nod. You're ready. Remember what we've practiced. With that, Matt straightened his suit jacket, squared his shoulders, and stepped forward into the building's dim lobby, ready to negotiate on behalf of a dream bigger than any of them, the building's owner. Mr. Riley
was already seated in the lobby.
waiting. He was a middle-aged Irishman with graying hair and a shrewd glint in his eye. Mark and Clara hung back by the door, just out of sight but close enough to overhear every word. Mark's heart thumped in his chest as he watched Matt stride across the room and extend his hand confidently. "Good morning, Mr. Riley," Matt greeted, his voice steady and firm. "Thanks for meeting with me." Riley looked Matt up and down, one eyebrow raised. "You're a bit young for the real estate game, aren't you?" he asked, his tone both curious and dismissive. Matt didn't flinch, keeping his expression friendly and businesslike. "I might be young, but I've done my homework. This building has potential, and I'm prepared to offer a fair price to see that potential realize." Riley's skepticism softened, if only slightly. "So, what kind of future do you see for this place?" "Quality housing," Matt replied, his voice carrying the confidence of all the hours he,
Mark,
and Clara had poured into crafting their proposal. "A place for professionals, teachers, lawyers,
doctors,
people who are looking for a better environment to live in. The way we see it, this building can be transformed." Riley narrowed his eyes, sensing the coded language in Matt's words. "And by professionals, you mean?" Matt didn't hesitate. "Black professionals," he said. "There's an underserved market here, Mr. Riley. People who are willing to pay for quality housing outside of the overcrowded neighborhoods. It's not just about fixing up a building, it's about giving them a place where they feel welcome, where they're given the dignity they deserve." For a moment, silence hung between them, thick and unyielding. Riley's face remained impassive, his gaze drifting to the window. "And what makes you think this neighborhood would be ready for that?" he asked, the faintest hint of a challenge in his voice. Matt met his gaze evenly. "It's time," he said simply. "The city is changing, and we're willing to pay you $30,000 now, with the rest in monthly installments. It's a solid offer, one you'd have a hard time getting elsewhere." Riley's expression softened just enough for Mark to notice a flicker of interest. He could see the calculations running behind Riley's eyes, the unspoken possibilities forming in his mind. And then,
slowly,
Riley nodded. "All right," he said,
his voice steady.
"You've got yourself a deal, son. But don't mess this up." As Matt sealed the agreement with a handshake, a wave of relief surged through Mark. It wasn't just a transaction. It was a crack in the wall, a glimmer of hope that the barriers they'd been facing could be chipped away, one piece at a time. Mark and Clara stepped forward, their faces lit with cautious joy. Matt grinned, letting the relief spill out in a rare smile. They had done it. It was their first victory, but it would not be their last. Underscore 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 underscore. Within weeks, Mark and Clara had moved quickly to begin the renovations. Clara took charge of the finances, her keen eye ensuring every dollar was spent wisely, stretching their funds as far as they would go. She handled every negotiation, every budget adjustment, with the same resolve she'd shown defending Mark's dreams against Uncle Joe's doubts. She'd grown up understanding the importance of grit and resilience, and she poured that strength into this project, proving herself as much a partner in this journey as Mark was. They faced challenges almost immediately. White neighbors scowled as they walked by, muttering under their breaths. A group of local business owners held a neighborhood meeting to discuss the problems that could arise with new owners on the block. But Mark wasn't intimidated. He had expected resistance. What he hadn't expected, however, was the solidarity from the tenants who began moving in. They were Black professionals, lawyers,
teachers,
nurses, people with stories similar to his own. People who had been pushed to the margins but now felt a cautious hope that they could finally belong. As the building transformed, so did the lives inside it. Neighbors who had once only nodded in passing began talking to each other, helping with renovations, and watching each other's kids. Clara organized potluck dinners, filling the air with laughter and warmth that spread through the building like sunlight. People who had spent years feeling like outsiders finally had a place they could call home. One evening, as Mark walked through the building, he overheard the laughter of children playing in the courtyard, their voices blending with the soft music spilling from an open window. For a moment, he just stood there, taking it all in. It wasn't just a building, it was a symbol, a promise of what could be. He felt an overwhelming pride that made his chest ache. A pride he hadn't felt since leaving Groville, since the night he'd promised himself he would change everything. Just as he was about to leave, a shadow fell across him. He turned to see Joe Mitchell, the jazz club owner and reluctant investor who had taken a chance on his vision, watching him with a rare smile. "You were right, Henderson," Joe said, clapping him on the back. "Maybe there's something to this crazy idea of yours after all." Mark grinned, feeling the weight of Joe's approval settle over him like a warm cloak. "This is just the beginning,
Joe.
We're going to keep pushing, one building at a time." Joe nodded, his gaze steady. "Then let's talk about what's next. Underscore 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 underscore. As they sat in Joe's club that night, discussing their plans to expand, Mark couldn't shake the sense of awe he felt. Here he was, sitting across from a successful businessman, talking strategy for their next move. Just a few months ago, he'd been shining shoes on the steps of Groville's bank, dreaming of breaking free.
And now,
he was not only free, he was leading the charge, with a vision to reshape the world around him. But he knew this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be hard, filled with more resistance, more prejudice, more battles. He'd have to prove himself, again and again. But he was ready for it. As the club filled with the sounds of a saxophone solo and the low hum of laughter and conversation, Mark looked out at the city lights stretching toward the horizon, each one a beacon of possibility. He didn't just want to change one building or one neighborhood. He wanted to change the world for people like him, for Clara, for their son, and for every person who had been told they couldn't, that they didn't belong. In that moment, Mark made a promise to himself. They would keep building, keep pushing, until the barriers fell and a new landscape stood in their place. One where dreams weren't dictated by the color of your skin. One where every family could feel that they finally belonged. The soft glow of dawn was just beginning to filter through the windows of their cramped kitchen as Mark reviewed the latest figures on the building's repairs, his fingers tracing the carefully penciled numbers.
Next to him,
Clara poured steaming coffee, her steady presence the only thing keeping him grounded as he considered the mountain ahead of them. They had secured one building, but the real challenge lay in expanding. Proving their success wasn't a one-off victory, but a strategy with legs, one that could open doors for Black families across Los Angeles. Joe Mitchell's words echoed in his mind from their last meeting at the jazz club. "You pulled off one deal," Joe had said, his tone a mixture of approval and warning. "But if you want to go bigger, be ready. This city doesn't take kindly to folks who don't know their place." Mark knew it was a challenge, but he was prepared. He wasn't interested in going back. His dreams had become too big for that. His first building had drawn attention, both good and bad, and now that they were considering a second, larger property, he knew the opposition would only intensify. A few days later,
Mark,
Clara, and Joe drove across town to a neighborhood where property values were beginning to dip as white families fled for the suburbs, anxious to escape the influx of diverse residents. The building was much larger than their first, a multi-story apartment complex on the cusp of a transitioning area. It was old but well-built, with intricate stonework and wide windows, the kind of structure that spoke of history and elegance that had long gone unappreciated. When they arrived, Joe turned to Mark, his expression unreadable. This place is a lot more than the last one. The risks are bigger, too. Mark nodded, undeterred. Bigger risks, bigger returns. This building could anchor the whole neighborhood. If we succeed here, we set the tone for future buyers, for everyone looking for a new home in LA. Joe studied him for a long moment, then grinned. All right, then let's see you make it happen, Mr. Henderson. But getting the building would prove harder than they anticipated. The owner, Mr. Howard Wexler, was a conservative, no-nonsense businessman in his 70s, known for his staunch resistance to unwanted change. Wexler had deep connections within the community, and Mark knew he was already a long shot. So once again, they called on Matt Sullivan. Matt had grown comfortable in his role as the face of their business, learning the language and style of negotiation that allowed him to move undetected in circles that otherwise barred Mark's entry. Over several evenings, they drilled Matt in every detail, rehearsing responses and practicing a calm, composed demeanor that would carry him through the meeting. On the morning of the negotiation, Matt adjusted his suit one last time and glanced back at Mark,
Joe,
and Clara with a look that was equal parts excitement and anxiety. Think they'll see through it this time? Mark shook his head, giving him an encouraging smile. Just remember why we're doing this, and don't give them a reason to doubt you. Matt nodded and walked into the building, his steps steady but purposeful. Inside, Wexler's office was as imposing as the man himself, walls lined with leather-bound books, shelves filled with model ships, and a massive oak desk that seemed to command the room. Wexler was waiting behind it, his piercing gaze fixed on Matt the moment he stepped inside. Mr. Sullivan, Wexler greeted, his tone guarded.
So,
You're interested in the property on Hawthorne Street?
yes,
Sir, Matt replied, extending a firm handshake. We believe the building has great potential, and we're prepared to make an offer. Wexler leaned back, studying Matt carefully. Potential for what?
exactly.
Matt kept his expression neutral. For quality housing that meets the needs of a growing demographic. There are professionals, doctors, lawyers, teachers who are seeking residences in areas like this. Black professionals, Wexler said, his voice carrying an unmistakable note of disdain. Matt held his ground.
Yes, sir.
There's a demand that hasn't been met, and this building is in a prime location. Wexler's eyes narrowed.
His fingers steepled.
And you think the current tenants will simply accept this change? We're prepared for any challenges. Matt replied smoothly. We'll improve the property, increase its value, and ensure a smooth transition for all tenants. It's a win-win. Wexler watched him for a long, tense moment before finally nodding. Very well, $70,000 with $50,000 up front. The remaining $20,000 in installments. But understand this, Mr. Sullivan, he added, his tone sharp. One misstep, and I'll make sure everyone knows who's behind this. The threat hung in the air, but Matt remained unfazed. Understood, Mr. Wexler. As he exited the office, Matt's face was pale but triumphant. Mark felt a rush of pride as they shook hands. We got it, Matt said, breathless. He agreed to our terms. But their victory was short-lived. Within days, whispers spread through the building as white tenants learned of the new ownership and the planned renovations. Their fears turned to action almost immediately. Some tenants threatened to leave. Others began circulating petitions. And more than a few vandalized the hallways and walls in protest. One morning, as Mark was overseeing renovations with Clara, Matt, and Joe, an elderly white woman named Mrs. Jenkins approached them, her face twisted with anger. What do you think you're doing here? She snapped, glaring at Mark with open hostility. This is a white building. You don't belong here. Mark held his ground, his voice calm but firm. I'm the new owner.
Ma'am.
We're making some improvements to the property. She scoffed, crossing her arms defiantly. I don't care who you say you are. You people bring nothing but trouble. Before Mark could respond, Matt stepped forward.
His voice steady. Ma'am.
I assure you, Mr. Henderson is the owner, and he's here to make this a better place for everyone. But Mrs. Jenkins wasn't swayed. She stormed off, muttering under her breath, and soon returned with 2 police officers in tow. The officers' expressions were stern, eyes narrowing as they looked over Mark and his team. What seems to be the problem here? Ma'am, one officer asked. This man. Mrs. Jenkins spat, pointing at Mark. Claims to own this building. I don't believe it for a second. He's trying to cause trouble. The officers turned to Mark, their gazes hard and unwelcoming.
Sir.
Do you have any proof that you own this property? Without missing a beat, Mark reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folder with the deed to the building. He handed it over, keeping his expression steady, refusing to show the frustration simmering beneath the surface. The officers scanned the document, then handed it back with thinly veiled reluctance. Everything seems to be in order, but I suggest you be respectful of the existing tenants. Of course, officer. Mark replied, his voice clipped. Sorry for the inconvenience. As the officers left, Joe shook his head, muttering under his breath. They're not going to make this easy for us. Mark. Mark clenched his fists, swallowing his frustration. I know, but we didn't come this far to give up now. Over the next few weeks, the challenges only intensified. Someone slashed the tires on the workers' trucks, broke windows, and sabotaged the plumbing. Each time, Mark's team repaired the damage and continued, refusing to let fear or intimidation drive them out. Joe called in favors, bringing in skilled black workers who were willing to help for a fair rate. Clara managed the finances with razor-sharp focus, stretching every dollar, haggling with suppliers, and finding ways to stay within budget. But as the weeks passed, a change began to take root. Black families and professionals who had been denied quality housing elsewhere began to move into the building, bringing a cautious hope with them. They greeted each other in the hallways, shared meals in the courtyard, and soon the building was alive with a warmth that Mark hadn't seen before. One evening, as Mark watched children play in the courtyard and neighbors chat on their balconies, he felt a deep sense of accomplishment. This wasn't just a business venture. It was a community, a place where people like him could feel safe, respected, and valued. Joe approached him, his expression softened in a way Mark hadn't seen before. You were right,
Henderson, he said,
clapping a hand on his shoulder. Maybe this crazy idea of yours has some legs after all. Mark smiled, a fierce resolve lighting his eyes. This is just the beginning.
Joe.
We're going to keep pushing, keep expanding, one building at a time. As they celebrated their progress, Mark's mind was already turning to the future, to the next building, the next neighborhood. He knew the battles ahead would be even harder, the opposition fiercer. But they had something more powerful than money or connections. They had purpose, a shared dream, and the unbreakable resolve of a community that believed in itself. Together, they would keep pushing, one step at a time, until the city they called home was one where everyone could live with dignity. And with each new building, they were not just reshaping the city, they were reshaping the future. One brick, one family, and one victory at a time. The morning air felt thick with anticipation as Mark Henderson sipped his coffee, staring at the bustling street outside his window. Los Angeles had become familiar, its sounds and rhythms grounding him as he planned each step of his vision. But the nagging thought that had been tugging at his mind for weeks had finally surfaced with clarity. If he wanted to make a lasting impact, he had to expand his strategy beyond property. Real change,
he realized,
wasn't just about creating safe spaces to live. It was about giving his community the financial power to own,
build, and thrive.
And the only way to do that was through a bank. That morning, he called Joe Mitchell and Matt Sullivan to meet at his place. Joe arrived first, his eyes narrowing with curiosity as he took in Mark's unusually tense posture. A few minutes later, Matt walked in, his gaze darting between the two men as he sensed the gravity in the room. "Boys," Mark began, setting down his coffee cup. "We've done well with these buildings. We've given people a chance to live with dignity and safety. But I've been thinking,
If we want this to last,
we need to go bigger. We need to create a system that opens doors, not just a few buildings." Joe leaned back, crossing his arms, a skeptical smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "All right, Henderson, what's cooking in that mind of yours?" Mark took a deep breath. "A bank. I want us to buy a bank." The room went silent. Matt blinked, looking at Mark as if he hadn't heard right. Joe let out a low chuckle, though his eyes remained sharp with intrigue. "You want to buy a bank?" he repeated slowly. "Mark, you do know that banks don't just sell themselves to whoever walks in with a few bucks, right?" Mark nodded, unshaken. "I know it's a long shot, but think about it. People in our community need capital for homes, for businesses, for education. They're blocked from these opportunities because they're shut out of fair banking practices. But if we owned a bank, we could change that." Matt leaned forward, his excitement building as the vision began to sink in.
so,
"We're not just giving people a place to live. We're giving them the power to create a future." "Exactly," Mark said, his eyes lighting up. "If we can control the money, we control the future. It's not just about real estate anymore. It's about building wealth." Joe's gaze grew serious as he studied Mark, the weight of his words sinking in. "This isn't just a business, Henderson. This is a revolution. You know they won't take kindly to us stepping into that arena." "Let them," Mark replied, undeterred. "We've faced worse. We have to try." Underscore 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 underscore. After months of research, Mark identified a struggling bank that seemed like the perfect target: Mainland Bank in Austin, Texas. The bank had been slowly bleeding money, its clientele shrinking as the city's demographics changed. The owner, Robert Florence Sr., was in his 70s, a man who wore his conservative views like a badge of honor. Mark knew Florence wouldn't sell to Black investors, especially ones with a mission like theirs. So once again, they leaned on Matt Sullivan to act as the frontman. "Florence is going to ask questions," Matt warned as they prepared. "He'll want to know why someone like me would be interested in a bank catering to underserved communities." "That's why we've rehearsed," Mark replied, looking Matt square in the eyes. "He'll see what he wants to see, a white investor with a vision for revitalizing the bank. Just stick to the plan." The morning of the negotiation, Matt donned his best suit and walked into the Mainland Bank headquarters in Austin, flanked by Joe, who posed as his silent chauffeur. Mark and Clara waited anxiously at a nearby hotel, their thoughts filled with the weight of the moment. Inside, Florence Sr. sat behind a heavy mahogany desk, his steely gaze fixed on Matt as he entered. Beside him stood his son, Robert Florence Jr., a younger, sharper version of his father, whose expression held an edge of disdain. "Mr. Sullivan," Florence Sr. greeted, his tone cold. "I understand you're interested in buying the Mainland Bank. May I ask why?" Matt kept his voice steady, his gaze direct. "There's a need that's not being met,
sir.
Minority-owned businesses, Black professionals, there's a demand for fair banking that isn't currently being served. I believe that if we cater to them, we'll bring in new deposits and revitalize this bank." Florence Jr. scoffed.
Cutting in.
"And you think our father's bank should cater to them?" Matt's tone remained calm. "I think your father's bank should cater to anyone willing to invest. Business is business." Florence Sr. watched Matt with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion before finally nodding. "All right, let's hear your offer." They had anticipated Florence's resistance, so the offer was deliberately generous: $500,000 for 80% of the bank's ownership. with Florence Sr. retaining a 20% stake and his son staying on as a credit expert. Florence Sr. looked at Matt, his eyes calculating. "It's an interesting offer," he said finally, though his tone was cautious. "But my son stays on. And if this goes south, you'll be the one holding the bag." "Understood, sir," Matt replied, extending a firm handshake. As he exited the office, his face was pale, but his eyes gleamed with triumph. Mark and Clara were waiting in the hotel lobby, their anticipation thick in the air. When Matt arrived and gave them a nod, Mark felt a surge of relief and pride. They had done it. They had crossed a barrier that few dared to approach. Underscore 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 underscore. Taking over Mainland Bank was a bigger challenge than any of them had anticipated. They worked tirelessly, making sweeping changes to offer fair loans, competitive rates, and transparent practices that had been previously denied to Black clients. Mark and Clara poured their energy into forging connections, reaching out to Black-owned businesses,
Churches.
and community leaders, encouraging them to trust the new direction of Mainland Bank. But it didn't take long for Florence Jr. to begin his attempts to sabotage them. He whispered to the bank's white clients, fueling fears of instability and tarnishing the bank's new management as unreliable. He contacted the press, framing the changes as reckless and irresponsible. He even visited longtime clients personally, urging them to withdraw their accounts, sowing seeds of distrust that could destroy everything they had built. One afternoon, as Mark and Clara reviewed the bank's accounts, a young clerk rushed into the room, his face pale. "Mr. Henderson, we're seeing a sudden spike in withdrawals. Dozens of accounts closed in the last few hours." Mark felt a chill wash over him. He knew this was Florence Jr.'s doing. He turned to Clara, his voice steady but firm. "We need to act fast. Call every Black preacher, business owner, community leader. We need their support now, more than ever." That evening, Mark stood in the pulpit of a packed church, his voice echoing through the crowd. "This isn't just about a bank," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "This is about our future, about our right to own, to build,
And to thrive.
If we let them scare us off now, we lose more than just money. We lose our chance to change the way they see us and the way we see ourselves." The response was overwhelming. The Black community rallied, transferring their money to Mainland Bank in droves, bolstering its balance sheets and sending a powerful message. They would not be intimidated. But Florence Jr. wasn't finished. Frustrated by the bank's stability, he filed a report with the Federal Reserve, accusing the new management of unsound banking practices. Days later, federal regulators announced an inspection. Mark gathered his team, knowing they couldn't afford a single error. Clara meticulously organized the records. Matt coordinated with the lawyers, and together they pored over every detail. When the regulators arrived, they combed through every transaction, every loan, every document, their scrutiny severe. Mark held his breath with every passing hour, the weight of their work hanging by a thread. After days of exhaustive examination, the lead inspector finally turned to them. "Everything appears to be in order," he said, almost reluctantly. "We'll be in touch if we find any discrepancies.
But for now,
You're clear." The team let out a collective sigh of relief. The victory small but significant.
they had passed the test.
If only barely. But the fight was far from over. Mark could feel it in the way the inspectors looked at him, in the thinly veiled hostility that simmered just beneath the surface. As they left the bank that evening, Joe clapped Mark on the shoulder, his face a mixture of pride and caution. "They won't let up, Henderson."
You know that, don't you?
Mark nodded, a fierce resolve in his eyes. "Let them come. We've proven we belong here, and we're not going anywhere." Together, They walked out of the bank and into the night, each step a testament to the battles they had won and the ones that still lay ahead. Mark knew they had crossed a line, stepping into an arena where few dared to tread. But he also knew that, with every passing day, they were building something bigger than themselves, a future that held the promise of true freedom. One loan, one home, one business at a time. And with that thought, he felt ready to face whatever came next, armed with the knowledge that they were no longer just fighting for themselves. They were fighting for a legacy. The morning sun cast sharp shadows across the bank's entryway as Mark stepped inside Mainland Bank, his senses on high alert. It had been weeks since the federal regulators had combed through every transaction, every account, leaving with an almost disappointed assurance that all was in order. But Mark knew that Florence Jr. wasn't one to back down. His suspicions were confirmed when he noticed the tense faces of his staff, their whispers hushed but charged with unease. He barely had time to settle in before Clara came striding into his office, her usually calm demeanor replaced by an intense urgency. "Mark," she said, shutting the door firmly behind her. "There's something you need to see." Mark's heart tightened as Clara handed him a letter from the Federal Reserve, delivered just that morning. It outlined a new round of investigations, spurred by credible accusations that the bank was engaging in fraudulent practices. The accusations, Clara explained, were too specific, too deliberate, to be random. "It's him," she said, her voice filled with frustration. "Florence Jr., he's been spreading rumors, calling in his contacts. And now he's got the federal regulators breathing down our necks again." Mark gripped the letter, anger flaring in his chest. He had expected resistance, but Florence Jr.'s tactics were growing bolder, more ruthless. It was clear this wasn't just about business, it was personal. Florence Jr. couldn't accept that the bank his family had controlled for decades was now under black ownership, or that it had become a symbol of empowerment for people he believed had no place in his world. "We'll face them," Mark said, his voice steady, though a storm raged beneath the surface. "We'll show them everything. Every document. Every loan. We're not backing down." Underscore 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 underscore. The second wave of inspections was even more exhaustive than the first. Inspectors pored over files, scrutinizing every detail with a determination that bordered on obsession. Day after day,
Mark, Clara,
and Matt sat with them, answering questions, providing documentation, and holding their ground, even as the tension wore them thin. But Florence Jr. wasn't satisfied with a federal inspection alone. Behind the scenes, he launched a smear campaign against Mainland Bank, planting stories in the local press that cast doubt on the bank's stability and on Mark's character. The articles painted a picture of reckless management, hinting at corruption and mismanagement without any real evidence, but enough insinuation to stir fear among clients. One article in particular struck a deep nerve. It hinted that Mark and his team were unqualified and taking advantage of clients unfamiliar with banking practices. The coded language was clear. It wasn't just about Mark's competency, but about his race, about the audacity of a black man daring to take on the institution of banking. The following days were some of the hardest Mark had faced. Every time he stepped into the bank, he saw it in the eyes of his white clients, their subtle glances, the polite but distant conversations, the accounts that closed without warning. Each one felt like a small betrayal, a reminder that, for some, the walls of prejudice were far stronger than loyalty. But even as clients withdrew their accounts and doubts grew, Mark noticed something unexpected, a surge of solidarity from the black community. Word of Florence Jr.'s sabotage had spread, and with it, a wave of resolve among black business owners, professionals, and families determined to stand by Mark and his team. One afternoon, Pastor Samuel Jenkins, a well-respected leader from a nearby church,
came into the bank.
his congregation in tow. They filled the lobby, a sea of familiar faces, each one a silent testament to their support. "Mr. Henderson," Pastor Jenkins said, his deep voice carrying through the room, "we've heard what they're saying about you. We know the truth. This bank represents more than just money to us. It's a piece of our future. We're not going anywhere." Around him, people nodded, murmuring their agreement, each one stepping up to transfer their savings, their trust, to Mainland Bank. It wasn't about the size of the accounts, it was about the collective strength of their commitment. Clara, standing beside Mark, squeezed his hand, her eyes misty with pride. "We're not just running a bank,
Mark.
we're leading a movement. Underscore, 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 underscore. The new deposits were enough to stabilize the bank for a time. But Florence Jr. had more tactics up his sleeve. When rumors and media slander failed to break them, he turned to outright sabotage. Late one night, as Mark was working on paperwork alone in the bank's office, a call came from Matt. "Mark." Matt's voice was urgent, nearly breathless. "We've got a problem. Someone's been messing with our accounts. There are discrepancies, large sums disappearing without a trace." Mark's stomach dropped. He had no doubt who was behind this, but proving it would be nearly impossible without evidence. Florence Jr. was a master at manipulation, planting seeds of doubt and chaos with a skill Mark grudgingly acknowledged. But this was different. This was a direct attack on their credibility, on their very existence. "I'll be right there," Mark said, grabbing his coat. As he drove through the dim streets of Los Angeles, a fierce determination hardened within him. Florence Jr. wanted to break him, to remind him of his place. But Mark had spent his whole life fighting to rewrite that narrative. He wasn't about to let a spoiled heir with a bruised ego take it all away. When he arrived, Matt and Clara were already going through the accounts, their faces tense with concentration. As they cross-referenced transactions, Mark's mind raced. The situation was dire if they didn't fix this. They risked everything they'd built. But he also knew that simply reacting to Florence's moves would only give him more power. "Enough," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the room. "We need to go on the offensive." Matt looked up,
Confused.
"What do you mean?" "Florence Jr. is trying to make us seem incompetent. Like we're not fit to run this bank. Let's show him he's wrong. Let's fight back publicly. Make this about more than just one bank. Make it about the rights we have to own, to manage, to build." The plan was bold, and it came with risks. But Mark was done with waiting for the next blow. The next morning, he held a press conference, his voice steady and clear as he laid out the truth, exposing the sabotage, the rumors, and the campaign designed to destroy them. "We are here to give this community the financial opportunities they've been denied for far too long," Mark said to the crowd of reporters. "And we're not backing down. This isn't just about a bank. This is about justice, about equality, about breaking down barriers that have held us back for generations." The story spread, gaining traction as Mark's words resonated with people across the city. For every rumor Florence Jr. planted, Mark countered with the truth, exposing the resistance they faced, the uphill battles they fought each day just to provide fair access to banking. Underscore, 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 underscore. Days after the press conference, Mark was back in the bank when he saw Florence Sr. himself walk through the door, his face drawn with a mixture of shame and frustration. "Mr. Henderson," he said,
his voice weary.
I've seen the headlines. I know what my son has done. Mark crossed his arms, his gaze unwavering. Then maybe it's time you told him to stop. Florence Sr. sighed, shaking his head. Robert has always been proud. He believes he's protecting what's his. Mark's eyes narrowed. Protecting it from who? From us. Florence Sr. looked away, unable to answer. But Mark didn't need one. He knew what he and his team represented to men like Florence Jr., a threat, a reminder that the old systems of control were crumbling. Tell your son he's already lost, Mark said, his voice quiet but filled with conviction. We're here to stay, and if he can't live with that, then he'll be the one who has to leave. As Florence Sr. turned to leave, Mark felt a weight lift. For the first time, he saw that this fight wasn't just about financial control. It was about changing the way they were seen, proving they had a right to this space, that they could and would thrive. In the days that followed, the community's support grew stronger. Clients who had once left returned, inspired by the defiance and resilience they saw in Mark and his team. Business owners, families, and young entrepreneurs all came together, pooling their resources, strengthening their network, and building something far bigger than a bank, a foundation for a future they could finally call their own. Mark knew the fight was far from over. There would be more inspections, more obstacles, and likely more sabotage. But he also knew that he and his team weren't alone. They had the backing of a community who believed in them, who trusted in their vision. As he stood in the lobby of Mainland Bank, watching his clients, his people, move through the space with pride and purpose, he felt a sense of peace, knowing that, no matter what, they had already won. Florence Jr. might still throw every roadblock he could muster, but Mark had the truth on his side, and he would keep building, keep fighting, until the world understood that their dreams, their progress, were unstoppable. The tension in Mainland Bank's boardroom was thick, nearly suffocating. Mark Henderson sat at the head of the table, his steady gaze moving from face to face as his team discussed the next steps. Despite their recent victories, public support, community solidarity, and a successful counterattack against Florence Jr.'s smear campaign, Mark knew that they were in the most dangerous stretch of their journey. Their bank was stable, but the pressure from external forces had only intensified. It was as though Florence Jr. had become obsessed, willing to burn his own reputation just to see Mainland Bank fall. His latest move came in the form of yet another legal threat, this time filed by a coalition of local property owners and business leaders, alleging that the bank's practices were destabilizing the financial security of the neighborhood. The thinly veiled language hinted at a threat more menacing than any legal action. These powerful individuals were bent on reclaiming their stronghold by any means necessary. Matt Sullivan broke the silence, his face pale and serious. Mark, they're using every loophole, every technicality they can find. They're claiming our loans are creating a risky environment for the community. It's baseless. But they're influential enough that they might convince a judge to listen. Clara's gaze was fierce as she looked around the room. This is just another way to wear us down, to bleed us dry with legal fees and public doubts. But we've come too far to let them win. We need a plan that forces their hand, a way to secure our positions so strongly that they can't touch us. Mark leaned back, his mind racing. He knew Clara was right. They had been on the defensive for too long. It was time to flip the narrative, to show the city and its power brokers that Mainland Bank wasn't just a business, but a force of change, a beacon of resilience and opportunity. After a pause, Mark spoke, his voice calm but unyielding. We're going to take this battle public, more public than ever before. We're going to bring our supporters into the spotlight and showcase the impact of this bank on their lives. But we're also going to push forward on something even bolder. Matt and Clara looked at him, intrigued. We're going to turn Mainland Bank into a model for community investment. Mark continued, his mind piecing together a vision that had been forming over months. We're going to build partnerships with local businesses, fund neighborhood schools, and support new Black-owned businesses. If they want to call us a threat, fine. We'll be a threat to the outdated system that's held us back. The plan was ambitious, and everyone in the room knew it, but it was also brilliant, striking at the heart of everything the opposition feared. If they could prove that Mainland Bank wasn't just stable but essential to the community's growth, their enemies' arguments would crumble. Underscore 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 underscore. Over the following weeks, Mark and his team threw themselves into the new mission. They met with local business owners, school principals, and community leaders, forging partnerships and laying out plans to invest directly in the community. Mark personally spoke at schools, neighborhood centers, and even on local radio stations, explaining how Mainland Bank was committed to uplifting the entire neighborhood, one project at a time. The response was overwhelming. Stories of people who had received fair loans for the first time, who had opened savings accounts for their children's futures, began pouring in. Mothers who were able to start small businesses, young professionals who had bought their first homes, and college students who had secured tuition loans came forward to share how the bank had given them hope. But not everyone was happy with Mainland Bank's success. One night, as Mark and Clara locked up the bank, they noticed a shadow moving in the alley beside the building. Before they could react, a rock smashed through one of the bank's front windows, shattering glass onto the sidewalk. Startled, Mark and Clara looked around, but the vandal had already fled into the darkness. The next morning, Mark arrived at the bank to find graffiti sprayed across the entrance in large, angry letters, "Stay out." Clara's face hardened when she saw it. "They're trying to scare us, trying to make us feel like outsiders in our own community." Mark nodded, his expression resolute. "Then let's make it clear we're not going anywhere." He ordered the window repaired, but he left the graffiti untouched, covering it only with a banner that read, "Mainland Bank, here to stay." The gesture was a defiant symbol, a statement that resonated with everyone who walked through the doors. Later that week, Mainland Bank hosted a community event, bringing together supporters, local businesses, and even journalists. The bank's lobby was filled with people, some dressed in business suits, others in work uniforms, all bound by a shared vision. Mark stood before them,
his voice steady,
his words carrying the conviction of a lifetime. "We're here to make a difference," he said, his voice echoing through the room. "And we're not just fighting for a bank. We're fighting for our right to own,
to thrive,
and to build a future on our terms." Mainland Bank is more than just a financial institution. It's a promise to every person here that we can build something better, together. The applause was thunderous, a wave of support that surged through the crowd, carrying with it the hopes of a community that had waited too long for a place of their own. Mark looked out, his heart swelling as he saw their faces, young, old, determined. Each person was a testament to why this fight mattered. Underscore 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 underscore. But the following day, a new obstacle arrived, this time in the form of a court summons. The coalition of property owners had succeeded in pushing their case to court, accusing Mainland Bank of destabilizing the neighborhood with unsafe lending practices and irresponsible community influence. The trial was set to be a spectacle, a public showdown where every detail of Mark's work would be scrutinized.
Mark, Clara,
and Matt prepared tirelessly with their legal team, combing through records, gathering testimonials from clients, and assembling data to counter every false claim. They knew that the court would be stacked against them, that their opponents were well-connected and ruthless. But they also knew that they had something their enemies didn't: truth. And the backing of a community that refused to be silenced. The day of the trial, the courtroom was filled with reporters, supporters, and detractors alike. The air was charged with tension, and Mark could feel the weight of every eye on him as he took his place at the defendant's table. Across from him, the lead attorney for the coalition looked smug, as though victory were a foregone conclusion. The coalition's attorney wasted no time, painting Mainland Bank as a reckless, unregulated force. He called witnesses who spoke about property devaluation and increased crime, their words thinly veiled attacks on the community Mark served. But when it was their turn, Mark's team delivered a powerful rebuttal. Clara presented evidence of the bank's sound lending practices, showing that their loans were backed by strict financial standards. Matt called clients who shared stories of how Mainland Bank had changed their lives, each testimonial a powerful reminder of the bank's positive impact. Finally, Mark took the stand. He faced the room with calm confidence, his voice unwavering as he delivered his message. "We're not destabilizing anything," he said, his gaze moving from the judge to the jury, to the packed gallery. "We're building something this city has never seen, an opportunity for every person, regardless of their background, to access the financial support they deserve. Mainland Bank isn't a threat. It's a bridge to a better future." The courtroom fell silent, his words hanging in the air. The coalition's attorney shot back, insisting that Mark's work was idealistic and dangerous, but Mark remained resolute. He had learned that truth could withstand any attack, and he held his ground with unshakable dignity. After days of tense testimony, the jury delivered its verdict. The court found that Mainland Bank had committed no wrongdoing. It was a victory, one that left the coalition scrambling and defeated. Underscore 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 underscore. That evening, as Mark,
Clara,
and Matt celebrated with their supporters at the bank, the sense of triumph was palpable. They had not only won the case, but had emerged stronger, with a renewed sense of purpose and unity. Their enemies had thrown everything they could at them, and yet, here they were, unbroken, unyielding. Mark stood in the midst of the celebration, feeling a wave of gratitude wash over him. The road ahead would still be long, the battles far from over. But tonight, they had proven something powerful, that when a community stands together, there is no force strong enough to tear it apart. As he looked around the room, he saw faces filled with hope and determination, the spirit of resilience that had carried them through every obstacle. Mainland Bank wasn't just a business, it was a testament to their strength, a foundation built on the dreams of everyone who had dared to believe. With a glass raised high, Mark toasted to the future, his voice strong and clear.
"To us," he said.
"To what we've built, and to what we're about to build next." The cheers rose like a wave, filling the room with the sound of victory, the sound of change. And as Mark looked toward the horizon, he knew that this was only the beginning. They were ready for whatever came next, and they would face it together, one dream, one building, one victory at a time. The morning after their courtroom victory, Mark stood in front of Mainland Bank, looking up at the building with a newfound sense of pride. The bank had endured relentless attacks, smear campaigns, and legal battles, and yet it stood strong, resilient, and unbreakable. The journey had been long and brutal, but he knew that every sacrifice, every sleepless night, had been worth it. They hadn't just built a bank, they had built a beacon of hope and possibility for their community. Inside,
Clara,
Matt, and Joe were already busy at work, discussing the latest partnerships with local businesses and planning new community outreach programs. Their victory in court had turned the tide of public opinion. People who had once been skeptical or afraid now saw Mainland Bank as a force for good, a place that stood for fairness, equality, and opportunity. The flow of new clients had surged, bringing in families, business owners, and young people with dreams of their own. As he walked into the bustling lobby, Mark felt the energy of the place. It was alive, filled with the hum of conversations, the laughter of children, and the warmth of community. This was what he had always dreamed of, a place where people like him could feel safe, respected, and empowered. A place where their dreams were nurtured, not dismissed. Joe approached him, a proud smile lighting his face. "You did it,"
Henderson, he said,
clapping Mark on the back. "You built something that can't be taken down. We built it together." Mark replied, his voice filled with gratitude. "Every one of us." Clara joined them, her gaze steady and filled with admiration. "This is just the beginning. You know, Mainland Bank has the potential to go beyond this neighborhood, this city. We could expand, reach other communities that have been shut out for too long." The thought sent a thrill through Mark. He had once dreamed of owning a single property, a building that would be a foothold in a world that wanted to keep him out.
Now,
He realized that vision had grown. They could build a network of banks across the country, each one a safe harbor for people who had been denied access to financial security and independence. "That's exactly what we're going to do," Mark said, his voice resolute. "This isn't just about Los Angeles anymore. It's about creating a legacy, a network of banks that will empower communities everywhere." Underscore 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 underscore. The following months were a whirlwind of growth and expansion. Mark and his team began scouting new locations, identifying neighborhoods where access to fair banking was practically non-existent. They met with community leaders, activists, and local politicians, spreading their message and building alliances that would support their mission. Every new location was a victory, a chance to bring their vision to life in a tangible way. But with each success came fresh challenges. The old power structures were relentless, determined to shut them down. Competitors tried to outbid them for properties. Hostile bank owners attempted to block their expansion. And local officials, influenced by the wealthy elites, threw up bureaucratic obstacles at every turn.
Yet,
For every setback, Mark's team found a way forward. They were a well-oiled machine by now, each member playing their part with skill and dedication. Clara managed the finances with sharp precision, stretching every dollar and negotiating every contract to keep them moving. Matt, now a seasoned frontman, navigated the world of high-stakes negotiation, winning over skeptical investors and partners.
Joe,
With his network of allies, secured resources and support from across the city's Black community and beyond. One afternoon, as they closed on yet another property, Matt looked at Mark, an incredulous smile on his face. "Can you believe it?
Mark,
We've got 6 branches already, and more people signing up every day. We're making history here." Mark nodded, the reality of it filling him with awe. "This is bigger than any of us could have imagined. But it's real now. We're giving people a real chance." Underscore 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 underscore. With Mainland Bank's success growing, the media finally took notice, publishing articles and stories about the bank for the people. Journalists, once skeptical, now celebrated the story of Mark Henderson, a man who had overcome every barrier to build a banking network for the underserved. They called it revolutionary, a new model for finance that put community before profit. Mark's story became a source of inspiration. He received letters from young entrepreneurs, students, and families across the country, each one filled with words of hope, encouragement, and dreams of building their own paths to success. Some were from struggling neighborhoods, others from towns where opportunity seemed like a distant dream. But all of them shared a newfound belief in what was possible. One evening, Mark received a call from Pastor Samuel Jenkins, who had stood by Mainland Bank during its toughest times. "Mr. Henderson," Pastor Jenkins said warmly, "I wanted to let you know we're dedicating this Sunday service to you and your work. You've done more than build a bank. You've given people hope. You've shown us what faith in action looks like." Mark was deeply moved, his voice thick with emotion as he replied, "Thank you,
Pastor.
This wouldn't have been possible without people like you. People who believed in us even when the odds were against us." Underscore 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 underscore. But amid the growth and celebration, Mark never forgot the underlying truth of their mission. There were still those who wanted to see them fail, people who would stop at nothing to dismantle what they had built. He knew they had to stay vigilant, to keep pushing forward, always one step ahead of those who doubted them. So he focused on creating a lasting foundation. He put together a team of young, ambitious Black bankers, training them not only in finance but in the values that Mainland Bank stood for: integrity,
Community.
and resilience. He invested in their futures, encouraging them to think big, to see themselves not as employees, but as future leaders who could carry the mission forward. One night, as Mark walked through the bank's original branch, he paused to look at the wall where the words "Mainland Bank, here to stay" were proudly displayed. He thought of all the people who had walked through these doors, the lives that had been changed, the dreams that had been sparked. He felt a quiet pride, a sense of peace knowing that this wasn't just a bank anymore. It was a legacy, a place where generations of families could come, knowing they would be treated with respect and fairness, a place where young people could see that there was no limit to what they could achieve. Underscore 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 underscore. Years later, Mainland Bank would be celebrated as one of the pioneering institutions in a movement that transformed banking for underserved communities across the country. New branches opened in cities across the nation, each one a testament to the dream that had started with Mark Henderson's determination to make a difference. People would look back on his journey as the beginning of a new era, a time when one man's vision had sparked a movement that changed the landscape of American finance forever. But for Mark, the true legacy of Mainland Bank wasn't in its buildings or its accounts. It was in the people who, like him, had been told they couldn't, that the world wasn't made for them. It was in every child who opened a savings account, in every entrepreneur who took out a loan to start a business, in every family who bought a home because someone had finally believed in their potential. Standing in the lobby of Mainland Bank, Mark smiled, his heart full with the knowledge that they had done it. They had built something bigger than any one person, something that would endure long after he was gone. They had turned a dream into a reality, a vision into a legacy.
And with that,
Mark knew that his fight was no longer his alone. It belonged to everyone who had ever dared to hope for more, to everyone who saw in Mainland Bank a reflection of their own dreams. As he walked out into the bustling streets, he felt the weight of the past lift, replaced by the promise of a future they had carved out together. Mainland Bank was here to stay, and so was the spirit of resilience, of courage, of unyielding hope that had brought it to life. The legacy was real, and it was only just beginning.